Hey everyone, and welcome to this quick 7-minute explainer. Our goal today is to build a truly wholesome end-to-end understanding of how geography actually creates global power. And we're doing that by looking at the Strait of Hormuz. It's a place that absolutely proves you do not need to be massive to be mighty. By the end of this explainer, you're going to see exactly how one simple physical location literally dictates economic reliance and political tension across the entire globe. So let's dive right into this core mystery. How exactly does a tiny waterway control the world? When we normally think of global power, we usually picture massive land masses, right? Huge militaries, sprawling economies. But the premise here is kind of completely counterintuitive. The power of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't come from being big at all. It comes from being small. To really get why, think of the strait like a single, narrow door in a super busy bazaar. There might be a ton of movement, commerce, and energy happening all around it. But if that one unavoidable doorway gets constrained, well, everything behind it slows down. Or, crucially, it gets a whole lot more expensive. The basic logic here is pretty simple. If you have to pass through, you are entirely subject to the doorway. This brings us to a really critical term, a choke point. It's basically a location that a lot of people must pass through, but which only a few can actually control. And the Strait of Hormuz is honestly one of the absolute clearest examples of this on Earth. It acts as the literal gate between major oil and gas producers and the open ocean. It essentially turns basic physical geography into massive global leverage. Now, just think about the contrast between an open ocean and a narrow strait. A wide open ocean is kind of like a huge open field, right? Ships can take basically any path they want. But a narrow strait? That's like a single corridor in a building. If everyone needs to use that exact same corridor, it becomes incredibly important. Think of a crowded grocery store, but there's literally only one open checkout lane. When movement gets concentrated into a tiny space like that, control suddenly becomes possible. That is our first irreducible truth here. Okay, so how does this actually build into real leverage? Well, geographic power comes down to 4 specific constraints. First off, the strait is physically narrow. Second, it connects a massive volume of energy supply to the outside world. Third, you can't easily bypass it. Alternatives are either super costly or just way too slow. And finally, it sits right between multiple states with completely different interests. This specific combination dictates exactly what can move and, more importantly, who gets to interrupt it. Location matters so much more than size. Think about a light switch on your wall. The switch itself is tiny, right? It doesn't generate the electricity, it didn't build the room, but it alone decides whether or not that room is actually usable. It's a really small action with a massive effect. The strait is just like that. It doesn't produce the oil, it just decides if the oil is allowed to leave the room. Looking at this breakdown brilliantly illustrates the mechanics of this leverage. It forms a really distinct pattern. A narrow passage obviously concentrates movement. Having limited alternatives creates intense dependence, because bypassing this choke point is just agonizingly hard. High volume ramps up its overall importance. The risk of disruption totally changes behavior. And shared control, well, that creates tension. This whole matrix is exactly why the strait is literally impossible to ignore. So what is actually flowing through here? Think of it as the global energy funnel. At the really wide top of the funnel, you have the entire region's massive energy production. Down at the bottom, you have the global market just demanding that energy. And right there in the middle, serving as the incredibly narrow neck of the funnel, is the Strait of Hormuz. When that much value tries to squeeze through such a tiny space all at once, the entire system becomes highly, highly sensitive. And we really have to remember that a disruption here isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's not like a delay in shipping, furniture. Energy is a base input. It powers transportation, electricity generation, heavy manufacturing, and literally all global supply chains. If oil shipments get disrupted here, it destabilizes a foundational commodity. When a choke point holds the key to a base input, its influence just multiplies exponentially across the entire globe. But of course, it's messy. No single actor completely owns or controls the Strait of Hormuz. A great way to think of it is like a shared staircase in a big apartment building. No one person fully owns the stairs, but everyone who lives there absolutely relies on them to get home. And because of that shared reliance, you get this inevitable friction, constant negotiation, and occasional conflict over who gets to use it and how safely they can do so. Let's shift gears and look at the psychological side. Because the crazy thing is, the strait doesn't even need to be physically blocked to exert power. Imagine a heavy glass cup teetering right on the edge of a table. Even if it never actually falls, everyone walking past it behaves carefully, right?
they slow down. They keep their distance. Just the mere risk of disruption profoundly alters how everyone behaves.
And that psychological risk creates a massive economic shadow. The market, you see, doesn't wait for a crisis to actually happen. If there's even a slight chance of disruption in the strait, insurers instantly charge more to cover tankers. Shipping companies reroute, navies deploy military patrols, and energy prices naturally spike, purely based on market anxiety. The map itself creates the risk, and that risk immediately shapes reality. Power emerges when dependence is one-sided. I really want you to let that sink in for a second. The asymmetry of leverage here is just incredible. For some nations, getting through this strait is literally a matter of economic survival. For others, it's really just an inconvenience. The side with greater exposure is under intense pressure. It's kind of like a thumb placed gently on a nerve. It doesn't take a lot of pressure to send a shock through the whole system. This really illustrates why the strait isn't just one single issue, but rather many stacked on top of each other. Different actors view this exact same strip of water completely differently. A shipping firm, they just want predictable, safe passage. A government sees a massive national security threat. Meanwhile, a trader sees market volatility and price problems. They are all looking at the exact same water, but depending on who's looking, the problem is entirely different. So you might be wondering, why does this matter to us? Well, this isn't just high-level map trivia. When tension rises in the Strait of Hormuz, the cost to insure those ships goes up. So the cost of the oil goes up. And that ripples directly into the transportation costs of the food at your local grocery store or the fuel you put in your car. A narrow passage thousands of miles away is literally reaching directly into your household budget through distant inflation. It all essentially operates in this continuous loop. First, energy simply must flow. Second, the narrow passage creates a massive dependence on that flow. Third, that dependence naturally breeds deep concern and vulnerability. And finally, that concern forces intense diplomatic and military protection. Strategic power isn't just about threatening to block the doorway, It's about the massive global effort required to fiercely protect the conditions that keep the whole system moving. Okay, let's take a step back. Honestly, congratulations, because you've just made a massive mindset shift. You've gone from seeing just a thin blue line on a map to understanding a complex, highly fragile global power system. You now see the geometry. It's super narrow. The function, it carries base energy. And the consequence, it dictates global prices and security. Maps, as it turns out, are not just geography. They are active, living power structures. We've seen how the geography creates leverage, how the energy creates dependence, and how that dependence reaches all the way into your wallet. But I want to leave you with one final, pretty provocative thought to ponder. If a single, narrow doorway holds this much absolute global power, and the entire world economy relies on it staying open, what happens when someone finally decides to close it? Think about that. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.